In the quiet corridors of Windsor Castle, where secrets have been whispered for centuries, one phone call was about to shatter everything the world thought it knew about the royal family. When King Charles III finally picked up the phone to call his son William, he had no idea that the conversation would reveal a truth about Camilla so shocking that it would change their relationship forever. What started as a routine father-son check-in became the moment that exposed a side of the queen consort that even her closest family members had never suspected. The revelation was so unexpected, so completely opposite to her public image, that it left both men speechless. This is the true story of that conversation and the extraordinary discovery that followed. A story that proves sometimes the people we think we know best are the ones hiding the most surprising secrets. Charles had always been a man of routine. Every Tuesday morning at precisely 10 o'clock, he would retreat to his private study in Clarence House, pour himself a cup of Earl Grey tea, and review the weekly schedule that his private secretary had carefully prepared. But on this particular Tuesday, in late October, something felt different. The autumn rain was drumming against the tall windows, creating a melancholy rhythm that seemed to match his restless mood. He found himself thinking about William more than usual. His eldest son had been carrying an enormous burden since becoming the Prince of Wales, and Charles couldn't shake the feeling that something was troubling him. The last time they had spoken, William had seemed distant, almost guarded in a way that reminded Charles of his own younger years when the weight of royal duty had felt overwhelming. Setting down his teacup, Charles reached for the secure phone on his mahogany desk. He rarely made spontaneous calls, but something deep in his father's instinct was urging him to check on William. The phone rang 3 times before his son's familiar voice answered, though there was a tension in it that Charles immediately noticed. "Father, this is unexpected," William said, and Charles could hear the sound of papers rustling in the background. "Is everything all right?" "I was about to ask you the same thing," Charles replied, leaning back in his leather chair. "You sounded rather strained during our last conversation. I thought perhaps we might talk properly, without the usual palace protocol getting in the way." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Charles could almost picture his son debating whether to speak openly or maintain the careful diplomatic tone they so often use with each other. Finally, William's voice came through, quieter now, but more honest. "Actually, Father, there is something that's been weighing on my mind. It's about Camilla." Charles felt his chest tighten. Ever since his marriage to Camilla, he had been acutely aware of the delicate balance between his role as husband and his role as father. He had always hoped that his children would come to accept and even appreciate Camilla, but he knew that Harry's relationship with her had remained complicated, and he had sometimes wondered about William's true feelings. "What about Camilla?" Charles asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. "It's probably nothing," William said, but his tone suggested otherwise. "It's just that Catherine mentioned something last week that caught me off guard." She was talking about a conversation she had had with Camilla during the garden party at Buckingham Palace. Charles found himself gripping the phone more tightly. Catherine had always been diplomatic about family matters, careful never to overstep boundaries or create unnecessary drama. If she had mentioned something significant enough to trouble William, it was worth taking seriously. "Catherine is very observant," Charles said carefully. "What did she tell you?" "She said that Camilla had pulled her aside during the reception, away from the other guests, and even away from the usual palace staff. Catherine thought it was going to be one of their typical conversations about the children or upcoming events. But instead, Camilla started talking about something completely unexpected." William paused again, and Charles could hear him taking a deep breath before continuing. "She told Catherine that she had been secretly working on something for the past 2 years, something that she hadn't even told you about. Catherine said that Camilla seemed almost nervous when she was explaining it, which struck her as odd because Camilla is usually so composed and confident in social situations." Charles felt a mixture of curiosity and concern wash over him. In their years of marriage, Camilla had always been refreshingly open with him about her interests and activities. She had her various charitable patronages, her love of reading, her close friendships that predated their relationship. The idea that she had been working on something in secret for 2 years seemed completely out of character. Did Catherine get any sense of what this project might be? Charles asked. That's the strange part, William replied. Camilla didn't give her any specific details, but she mentioned something about research and documents, and she asked Catherine if she thought the family would be supportive of something that might seem unconventional. Catherine said that Camilla seemed to be choosing her words very carefully, almost as if she was testing the waters to see how the idea might be received. Charles set down his teacup and rubbed his temple, feeling the beginning of what might become a headache. Throughout their relationship, one of the things he had most appreciated about Camilla was her straightforward nature. She didn't play games or keep secrets, and she had always been refreshingly direct about her thoughts and feelings. The idea that she had been working on some mysterious project without his knowledge was genuinely puzzling. There's more, William continued, his voice taking on a slightly more serious tone. After the garden party, Catherine mentioned the conversation to one of her friends who works in arts administration. Apparently, this friend had heard rumors in her professional circles about someone connected to the royal family making inquiries about historical research and documentation. The timing would match what Camilla had mentioned. What kind of historical research? Charles asked, though he suspected that William's information would be vague. Catherine's friend didn't have specifics, but she mentioned something about genealogical records and possibly some connection to literary or artistic heritage. The friend thought it was interesting because it seemed to be more extensive and serious than the typical family history research that people sometimes undertake. Charles found himself staring out the rain-streaked window, trying to process this information. Camilla had always been interested in history, and she had occasionally mentioned wanting to learn more about her own family's background, but he couldn't recall any recent conversations about serious genealogical research. More importantly, he couldn't understand why she would feel the need to keep such a project secret from him. William, Charles said slowly, I have to tell you that this comes as a complete surprise to me. Camilla and I discuss most things, and I can't think of any reason why she would feel the need to hide a research project, especially one that she's been working on for 2 years. That's what concerned Catherine, William admitted. She said that Camilla seemed almost apologetic when she mentioned it, as if she knew that keeping it secret might cause problems, but felt she had good reasons for doing so. Catherine got the impression that whatever Camilla is working on, it's something that could potentially have implications for the family as a whole. Charles felt a growing sense of unease. In his years as heir to the throne, and now as king, he had learned to be particularly sensitive to anything that might have implications for the family. The royal family lived under constant scrutiny, and any unexpected revelations or changes in established narratives had the potential to create media storms or public relations challenges. Did Catherine ask Camilla directly for more details? Charles inquired. She tried to, but Camilla deflected the questions with her usual charm. Catherine said it was skillfully done, but it was clear that Camilla wasn't ready to share more information. However, she did say something that Catherine found particularly intriguing, which was, Camilla mentioned that when she was ready to reveal what she had been working on, it might help people understand her better, and it might even change how some people view her role in the family's history. Catherine said that Camilla seemed both excited and nervous about this prospect, almost as if she was anticipating both positive and negative reactions. Charles felt his pulse quicken. Any statement about changing how people viewed Camilla's role in the family's history immediately triggered his protective instincts, both as her husband and as someone who understood the complexities of public perception regarding their relationship. Father, William continued, I want you to know that I'm not bringing this up to create problems or to suggest that Camilla is doing anything inappropriate. Catherine and I both trust her judgment, and we certainly don't want to interfere in her personal projects. But given the potential family implications she mentioned, we thought you should be aware of the situation. You were absolutely right to tell me, Charles assured him, though his mind was racing with questions and possibilities. I appreciate your discretion in handling this, and please thank Catherine for her thoughtfulness in sharing her observations. After they had said their goodbyes, and Charles had hung up the phone, he remained sitting in his study for nearly an hour, staring at the rain and trying to make sense of what he had just learned. He reviewed his recent conversations with Camilla, looking for any clues he might have missed, any signs that she was preoccupied with a secret project. There had been times recently when she had seemed particularly absorbed in something, moments when he would find her reading intently or making notes, but he had assumed she was working on speeches or correspondence related to her royal duties. Now he wondered if there had been more to those quiet, focused moments than he had realized. The question that troubled him most was why Camilla felt the need for secrecy. In their relationship, they had always prided themselves on honest communication, and he couldn't imagine what kind of research project would require such discretion. Unless, he thought with growing concern, it was something that she believed might upset or worry him. As the afternoon wore on, Charles found himself unable to concentrate on his usual tasks. He kept returning to William's words about Camilla wanting people to understand her better and potentially changing perceptions of her role in the family's history. What could she possibly have discovered that would have such significant implications? By evening, Charles had made a decision. Rather than letting his curiosity and concern continue to grow, he would talk to Camilla directly. But he would need to approach the conversation carefully, making it clear that he wasn't upset about the secrecy, but simply wanted to understand and support whatever she was working on. As he prepared for dinner, Charles reflected on how this unexpected phone call with William had already changed something fundamental in his understanding of his current situation. For the first time in years, he realized that there were aspects of Camilla's life and thoughts that remained a mystery to him, and that discovery was both unsettling and, in a strange way, intriguing. He had always believed that long-term relationships were built on the gradual revelation of deeper layers of personality and experience. Perhaps Camilla's secret project was simply another such layer, waiting to be revealed when she felt ready to share it. But as Charles straightened his tie and prepared to join his wife for dinner, he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever Camilla had been working on for the past 2 years was going to be far more significant than a typical research project. The evening ahead would determine whether his instincts were correct and whether the conversation that was about to unfold would indeed change everything he thought he knew about the woman he had married. Dinner that evening was served in the smaller dining room at Clarence's house, the one that Camilla had always preferred for their private meals together. The intimate setting, with its warm lighting and comfortable chairs, usually made Charles feel relaxed and at home. But tonight, he found himself studying his wife's face across the polished mahogany table, looking for signs of the secret project that William had described. Camilla seemed perfectly normal as she discussed the day's events, sharing amusing stories about her morning visit to a literacy charity and asking about his meetings with government officials. She was as engaging and attentive as always, but Charles found himself listening more carefully to her words, wondering if there were hidden meanings or carefully omitted details. "You seem rather quiet tonight," Camilla observed as they finished their main course. "Difficult day with the ministers?" Charles realized he had been unusually subdued during their conversation. "Actually, I had an interesting phone call with William this afternoon," he said, deciding to approach the topic gradually rather than diving directly into uncomfortable questions. "How lovely," Camilla replied, her expression brightening. "How are Catherine and the children? I haven't seen them properly since the garden party last week." The mention of the garden party gave Charles the opening he had been looking for. "Funny you should mention that. William said that Catherine had enjoyed her conversation with you there. She mentioned that you had talked about a project you've been working on." For just a moment, so briefly that Charles almost missed it, Camilla's fork paused halfway to her mouth. Then, she continued eating as if nothing had happened, but he noticed that her chewing seemed more deliberate, as if she was buying herself time to think. "Did she?" Camilla asked after swallowing. "I'm afraid I had so many conversations that day that they've all rather blurred together. What did Catherine say we had discussed?" Charles felt a small pang of disappointment. The evasive response was unlike Camilla, who normally had an excellent memory for conversations and rarely claimed to have forgotten details of important social interactions. She mentioned that you had talked about some research you've been doing, Charles said gently. Something you've been working on for quite some time, apparently. This time, there was no mistaking Camilla's reaction. She set down her fork entirely and looked directly at Charles, her blue eyes showing a mixture of emotions that he couldn't quite read. There was surprise, certainly, but also what looked like relief and perhaps a touch of apprehension. "Ah," she said simply, and then fell silent for several long seconds. Charles waited, giving her the space to decide how much she wanted to share. In their years together, he had learned that Camilla responded better to patience than to pressure, and he suspected that this moment required particularly careful handling. "I suppose I should have expected that Catherine would mention it," Camilla finally said, reaching for her wine glass. "She's very observant, and I'm afraid I wasn't as discreet as I thought I was being." "Darling," Charles said, leaning slightly forward, "you don't need to tell me anything you're not ready to share. But I have to admit that I'm curious about what could require such secrecy. It's not like you to work on something for 2 years without mentioning it." Camilla took a sip of wine and seemed to be gathering her thoughts. When she looked back at Charles, her expression had shifted to something more serious and determined. "You're right, of course. It's not like me at all. But this project has been rather complicated, and I haven't been entirely sure how to talk about it, particularly with you." "With me?" Charles asked, genuinely puzzled. "Why would you be uncertain about discussing a research project with me?" "Because," Camilla said slowly, "it's not exactly the kind of research that people would expect from me, and because the discoveries I've made have been rather surprising, even to myself. I've been worried about how you might react, and honestly, I've been concerned about the implications for our family." Charles felt his stomach tighten. Any project that had implications for the family was automatically cause for concern, given the constant scrutiny they lived under and the potential for media sensationalism around any unexpected revelations. "What kind of research have you been doing?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm and supportive. Camilla was quiet for another long moment, clearly debating how much to reveal. Finally, she seemed to make a decision. "I've been researching my family's genealogy," she said, "but not in the typical way that people trace their ancestry. I've been specifically investigating some stories and documents that my grandmother mentioned to me years ago, long before I ever imagined I would be in this position." "What kind of stories?" Charles asked. "Stories about artistic and literary connections in my family's past," Camilla replied. "My grandmother used to hint that there were creative talents in our bloodline that had been overlooked or forgotten. She would make cryptic comments about family members who had been writers or artists, but she was always vague about the details." Charles found himself relaxing slightly. Family history research, even with artistic connections, seemed relatively harmless. "That sounds fascinating, actually. Why were you worried about telling me?" "Because," Camilla said, setting down her wine glass and looking directly at him, "the research has led me to discover that some of those family stories were not just stories. I've found documented evidence of connections that I never expected, and some of these connections have literary and historical significance that goes far beyond typical family genealogy." "What kind of connections?" Charles asked, his curiosity genuinely piqued now. Camilla hesitated again, then seemed to steel herself for whatever revelation was coming. "Charles, I've discovered that I'm directly descended from several historically significant literary figures. Not distant connections, but direct lineage that can be thoroughly documented. And some of these connections involve literary works and historical events that most people would find quite surprising." Charles waited for her to continue, sensing that she was building up to something more significant. "One of the most startling discoveries," Camilla went on, "is that I'm directly descended from a woman who was not only a published author in the 18th century, but who is also closely connected to some of the most important literary circles of her time. This woman wrote under a pseudonym, and her work has been attributed to other authors for centuries." "That's remarkable," Charles said, and he meant it. "But why would such a discovery worry you?" "Because," Camilla replied, "this particular ancestor didn't just write novels or poetry. She wrote detailed accounts of court life and political intrigue during a particularly sensitive period in British history. Her writings include observations about the royal family of her time that were considered scandalous, and some of her work was suppressed because it was deemed too revealing about private royal matters. Charles felt a chill of understanding. Any historical documents that contained revealing information about royal family members, even from centuries past, had the potential to create modern complications, especially if they were newly discovered or attributed. What exactly did she write about? He asked carefully. That's where it gets complicated, Camilla said. I've found manuscripts and letters that suggest she had insider access to court events and private conversations involving King George III and his family. Some of her accounts contradict the official historical records, and others provide details about royal family dynamics that were never meant to be public knowledge. And you believe these documents are authentic? I've had them examined by experts in historical authentication, Camilla replied. The paper, ink, and handwriting have all been verified as genuine 18th century materials. More importantly, I've found corroborating evidence in other archives that supports many of the claims she made in her private writings. Charles was beginning to understand why Camilla had been secretive about her research. Any newly discovered documents that provided alternative perspectives on royal history had the potential to create scholarly interest and media attention, neither of which was necessarily welcome. How extensive are these documents? He asked. That's what I've been working on determining, Camilla said. I've found letters, journal entries, and what appears to be an unpublished manuscript that runs to several hundred pages. My ancestor seems to have been an obsessive documenter of everything she observed and heard. And you think this information could have implications for our family today? Camilla nodded slowly. Not direct implications, certainly. The events she wrote about happened more than 2 centuries ago. But some of her observations about royal family relationships and court politics are remarkably similar to modern situations. Reading her accounts has been like looking into a mirror that reflects patterns that seem to repeat across generations. Charles found himself intrigued despite his concerns. What kind of patterns? She wrote extensively about the challenges faced by family members who married into the royal family, particularly women who came from aristocratic but non-royal backgrounds, Camilla explained. Her observations about the difficulties of adapting to royal protocols, managing public expectations, and maintaining personal identity within institutional constraints are remarkably contemporary in their relevance. That does sound fascinating, Charles admitted. But I still don't understand why you felt you needed to keep this research secret from me. Camilla reached across the table and took his hand, because some of her writings are quite critical of the institution of monarchy itself. She wrote about the personal costs of royal duty, the artificial nature of court life, and the ways that royal protocols could damage individual relationships and personal happiness. I was worried that you might see her critiques as reflections of my own feelings about our life together. Charles felt a wave of understanding and sympathy. Darling, you could have trusted me with these concerns. I would never assume that your ancestors' opinions necessarily reflected your own views. I know that intellectually, Camilla replied. But emotionally, I was worried about how these discoveries might be interpreted both by you and potentially by the public if the information ever became known. The last thing I wanted was to create problems or controversies based on historical documents that I had uncovered. What do you plan to do with this research? Charles asked. That's what I've been trying to decide, Camilla said. The historian in me believes that these documents have genuine scholarly value and should be properly studied and potentially published. But the royal family member in me is aware that any historical revelations, however old, can be spun in a modern commentary about our current situation. Charles squeezed her hand gently. Have you considered consulting with royal historians or palace advisors about how to handle this appropriately? I've thought about it, Camilla replied, but I wanted to be certain about the authenticity and significance of what I had found before involving anyone else. I also wanted to make sure that I understood the full scope of the material before making any decisions about what to do with it. And do you feel that you understand the full scope now? I think I'm close, Camilla said. There are still some documents that I haven't been able to fully authenticate, and there are gaps in the story that I'm hoping to fill with additional research. But I've learned enough to know that this is potentially significant historical material. Then, perhaps it's time to bring in some expert advice, Charles suggested. There are people who specialize in managing historical discoveries that have potential sensitivity for the royal family. They could help you determine the best way to handle this responsibly. Camilla looked relieved at his supportive response. You're not concerned about the potential complications? I'm always concerned about potential complications, Charles replied with a slight smile. But I'm more concerned about supporting your interests and ensuring that historically significant material is handled appropriately. Besides, if these documents are as fascinating as you describe, they might actually enhance understanding of royal history rather than creating problems. There's one more thing, Camilla said, her expression becoming serious again. One of the reasons I mentioned this to Catherine is that I'm considering writing about my discoveries. Not just publishing the historical documents, but writing about the experience of uncovering this family history and what it has taught me about the continuity of certain royal family dynamics across centuries. Charles felt his eyebrows rise. A book, possibly, Camilla replied. Or perhaps a series of essays or articles. I think there could be value in sharing not just the historical discoveries, but the personal insights that come from seeing one's own family history intersect with royal history in unexpected ways. This revelation put an entirely different perspective on Camilla's secret project. A book by the Queen Consort about royal history and family dynamics would certainly attract significant attention, and the content would need to be very carefully considered. That would indeed be quite an undertaking, Charles said thoughtfully, and it would certainly explain why you felt the need to research and plan carefully before discussing it. I wanted to be sure that I had something worthwhile to say before I mentioned the possibility, Camilla explained. And I wanted to understand the historical context thoroughly before I considered writing about the modern parallels I've observed. As Charles looked across the table at his wife, he realized that his understanding of her had just expanded in ways he hadn't anticipated. The woman he had thought he knew completely had been quietly pursuing a substantial intellectual project that revealed both scholarly capability and thoughtful consideration of complex family dynamics. The evening was far from over, and Charles suspected that there were still more revelations to come. After dinner, Charles and Camilla moved to the library, where she had promised to show him some of the documents she had been researching. The room was one of Charles's favorites in Clarence House, lined with tall bookshelves filled with volumes on history, philosophy, and literature that he had collected over decades. Tonight, however, his attention was entirely focused on the leather portfolio that Camilla carefully retrieved from a locked drawer in the antique writing desk. I want you to understand, Camilla said as she set the portfolio on the coffee table between them, that what I'm about to show you represents only a small portion of what I've discovered. I've been working with archivists and authentication experts to verify everything, and the process has been quite extensive. Charles settled into his favorite armchair and watched as Camilla opened the portfolio with the care of someone handling precious artifacts. Inside were photocopies of what appeared to be handwritten letters and documents, along with typed transcriptions and notes in Camilla's own handwriting. This, Camilla said, lifting out a photocopied page covered in elegant 18th century script, is a letter from my great-great-great-grandmother, Elizabeth Shand, to her cousin in 1785. It was found in a collection of family papers that had been stored in an attic for over 2 centuries. Charles leaned forward to examine the document. The handwriting was indeed beautiful, flowing, and confident in the manner of someone who had received excellent education. Even in photocopy form, he could see that the paper had aged to a deep cream color, and there were small stains and spots that spoke to the document's antiquity. Elizabeth Shand was married to a gentleman who served in a minor capacity at court, Camilla continued. According to the records I found, He was responsible for managing some of the correspondence between the royal household and various government offices. It wasn't a particularly elevated position, but it gave Elizabeth access to court events and social gatherings. And she wrote about what she observed? Charles asked. Extensively, Camilla replied, lifting out another document. But here's what makes her particularly interesting. She wasn't just recording social gossip or surface observations. She was analyzing the psychology of royal family relationships and the political implications of personal dynamics within the monarchy. Camilla handed Charles the transcription of the letter he had been examining. "Read this passage," she said, pointing to a section about halfway down the page. Charles read aloud. "The Queen's relationship with her eldest son continues to be a source of considerable tension within the household. His Majesty appears to favor a more traditional approach to royal duties, while the prince advocates for what he describes as necessary adaptations to changing public expectations." Yesterday's heated discussion in the blue drawing room was overheard by several servants, and the disagreement seemed to center on the prince's belief that the monarchy must evolve to remain relevant, while the king insists that fundamental traditions must be preserved without compromise. Charles looked up at Camilla with surprise. She was writing about King George III and the future George IV? "Yes," Camilla replied. "And this was written during a period when these kinds of internal family conflicts were definitely not meant to be documented by outsiders. But Elizabeth seemed to have remarkable access to private conversations and personal interactions. How did she manage that?" "That's what I've been trying to piece together," Camilla said, pulling out a folder containing genealogical charts and historical timelines. "From what I can determine, Elizabeth was not just married to a court official. She was also personally trusted by several female members of the royal family. She appears to have served as an unofficial confidant to some of the princesses and other royal women." Charles studied the family tree that Camilla had constructed, tracing the connections between Elizabeth Shand and various court figures of the 1780s. "This is remarkably detailed research," he observed. "It gets more interesting," Camilla said, her voice taking on the enthusiasm of someone sharing a fascinating discovery. Elizabeth didn't just observe and record. She also analyzed what she saw, and her insights into royal family dynamics are surprisingly sophisticated. Camilla handed him another transcription, this one from what appeared to be a private journal entry rather than a letter. "Read this," she said. Charles read. "I have been observing the peculiar pressures that affect those who marry into this most extraordinary family, and I am struck by the consistent patterns that emerge regardless of the individual personalities involved. The institution seems to require a kind of personal transformation that can be deeply challenging to maintain while preserving one's authentic self. Lady ___ struggles daily with the expectation that she must embody an idealized version of nobility that bears little relationship to her actual temperament and interests. The constant performance of royal identity appears to create a division within the person between their public and private selves that can become quite painful over time." Charles set down the transcription and looked at Camilla with a new appreciation for what she had uncovered. She was writing about the psychological impact of royal life. In 1785, Camilla confirmed, more than 2 centuries before modern psychology had developed the language to describe these concepts formally. But Elizabeth was identifying and analyzing patterns that we would now recognize as quite sophisticated observations about institutional pressure, identity conflict, and the personal costs of public roles. "And you said there are hundreds of pages of this." The complete collection includes personal letters, journal entries, character sketches of various royal family members, and what appears to be an unpublished manuscript that Elizabeth was working on about court life, Camilla explained. "She seems to have intended to write a book about her observations, though obviously she never published it." Charles leaned back in his chair, trying to process the implications of what Camilla was showing him. This could genuinely revolutionize how historians understand the personal dynamics of George III court. "That's what the authentication experts have told me," Camilla agreed. "But there's more that makes this particularly relevant to our current situation." She pulled out another folder, this one containing what appear to be more recent research notes and analysis. As I've been reading through Elizabeth's writings, I've been struck by how many of her observations about royal family challenges seem to apply directly to situations we've faced in our own time, Camilla said. The pressure she described, the conflicts between personal authenticity and institutional expectations, the difficulties of adapting to royal protocols while maintaining individual identity. These are remarkably similar to challenges that modern royal family members have experienced. You mean the parallels go beyond general observations about court life? Much beyond, Camilla replied. Elizabeth wrote extensively about the challenges faced by people who married into the royal family from aristocratic but non-royal backgrounds. She analyzed how these individuals had to navigate the transition from their previous social identities to their new roles as royal family members. Camilla handed him a particularly thick folder. She wrote detailed character studies of 3 different women who married into the royal family during her time at court, and her analysis of their psychological and social adjustments is remarkably perceptive. Charles opened the folder and found page after page of handwritten notes in Elizabeth's elegant script, along with Camilla's modern annotations and cross-references. Listen to this passage about Lady Margaret, who married the king's younger brother, Camilla said, reading from one of her transcriptions. The transformation required of her has been both external and internal. She must learn not only new protocols and procedures, but must restructure her understanding of her own identity and purpose. The woman she was before marriage exists now only in private moments, while the public Lady Margaret __ is a carefully constructed persona designed to meet institutional expectations. The psychological strain of maintaining this division appears to increase over time, particularly when the private self and public persona require contradictory responses to the same situations. That's an extraordinarily sophisticated analysis for the 18th century, Charles observed, and remarkably relevant to modern royal experience, Camilla added quietly. Charles looked at his wife with new understanding. Is this why you were hesitant to share this research with me? Because you saw parallels to your own experience? Camilla nodded. Reading Elizabeth's observations about the women who married into the royal family during her time has been like reading about my own journey, but with the benefit of historical perspective. She identified patterns and challenges that I've lived through, but she analyzed them with an objectivity that's impossible when you're in the middle of the experience. And you think there's value in sharing this perspective publicly? I think there could be, Camilla said carefully, not as a way of criticizing the institution or complaining about personal challenges, but as a way of providing historical context for understanding how certain aspects of royal life have remained consistent across centuries. Charles was quiet for several minutes, reading through more of Elizabeth's writings and considering the implications of Camilla's discovery. The material was genuinely fascinating from a historical perspective, but it also raised complex questions about how such personal insights into royal family dynamics should be handled. There's something else I need to show you, Camilla said, retrieving one final document from the portfolio. This is what convinced me that Elizabeth's work has contemporary relevance that goes beyond academic interest. She handed him a photocopied page that appeared to be from Elizabeth's unpublished manuscript. The handwriting was slightly different, suggesting that this had been written later in her life. This is from what appears to be the conclusion of her book, Camilla explained. She wrote it after observing the royal family for more than 20 years. Charles read the passage that Camilla indicated. My years of observation have led me to conclude that the institution of monarchy creates certain inevitable tensions between personal happiness and public duty that cannot be entirely resolved through individual effort or goodwill. These tensions are not failures of character or commitment, but inherent challenges that arise from the fundamental nature of hereditary public service. Understanding these patterns as institutional rather than personal problems might allow future generations of royal family members to navigate these challenges with greater self-compassion and clearer expectations about what can and cannot be changed through individual action. She was advocating for institutional understanding rather than personal blame, Charles said thoughtfully. Exactly, Camilla replied. And she was suggesting that recognizing these patterns could help royal family members develop more realistic expectations and better coping strategies. And you see this as relevant to contemporary royal experience? I see it as potentially helpful to anyone trying to understand the human dimension of royal life, Camilla said. Elizabeth's historical perspective might provide context that could help people understand that certain challenges faced by modern royal family members are not unique to them personally, but are patterns that have existed for centuries. Charles closed the folder and looked at his wife with a mixture of admiration and concern. This is remarkable research, Camilla, and Elizabeth's insights are genuinely profound. But publishing this material, especially with contemporary parallels, would certainly attract significant attention. I know, Camilla replied. That's why I've been so careful about authenticating everything and thinking through the implications. I don't want to create unnecessary controversy, but I also think there's genuine value in this historical perspective. What would you want to accomplish by sharing this publicly? I hope that understanding these historical patterns might help people develop more nuanced perspectives on royal life, Camilla said. Instead of viewing royal family challenges as evidence of personal failings or institutional crisis, perhaps people could understand them as natural tensions that have always existed and can be managed with appropriate support and understanding. As Charles considered everything that Camilla had shared with him that evening, he realized that her secret project had revealed not just fascinating historical material, but also a sophisticated understanding of royal life that he had never fully appreciated. The woman who had seemed so straightforward and uncomplicated had been quietly developing insights that could genuinely contribute to public understanding of the monarchy. The question now was how to proceed with these remarkable discoveries in a way that honored both their historical significance and their potential contemporary relevance without creating unintended complications.